everyone, and welcome to Sustainable Portchester Alliance's Book Talk. My name is Joan Grosgenois-Thomas, and I'm a proud member of Sustainable Portchester Alliance. And welcome to our first book talk. We are so proud to host Portchester resident and Purchase College professor Elise Lemire, who will present on her recently released book, Battle Green, Vietnam, the 1971 March on Concord, Lexington, and Boston. And we're doing this today, September 21st, on International Peace Day. And we thought that would be a great time to bring everyone together to have Elise talk to us about her book. For those of you who are not aware, Sustainable Portchester Alliance is a nonprofit organization that includes residents, civic organizations, and labor working together for responsible development and civic engagement. Our current effort is to get people to register to vote. So we hope you will join us in that effort to get Portchester residents to vote in our next elections. I'd like to also introduce, or to at least let you know, of our team this evening, our tech team of Ragav Joshi and Stacy Harris. Ragav is a student at Blindbrook High School, and Stacy is with the Portchester-Rye Library. And so thank you both to them very much for helping us out. We couldn't have done it without you. Just a little housekeeping right now. We're asking attendees to use the Q&A feature. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. And so if you have a question, please make sure you post it in the Q&A. And the event will be an hour. We have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. So we will not waste any more time. Would love to have you all meet Elise Lemire. Thank you. Hi, Elise. How are you? You're muted.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. Thank you so much to the Alliance for organizing this event. It's a perfect day to have it, and I couldn't be more pleased to be here with you and with Chester Edwards.
Yes, your special guest, Chester Edwards, and we'll get to hear from him in a little while. So again, I just wanted to thank you for doing this. I think it's really, the Alliance thinks it's really important for folks in Portchester to know all of the wonderful resources that we have and the people who populate our community. And I'm sure some folks might have seen you playing tennis on the high school tennis field.
Playing
Are
tennis
you still playing there?
Oh, I'm playing all over with many friends from Portchester.
Awesome.
It's a favorite
awesome.
activity.
Very good. So I'm going to step away. I will leave it up to you. Take it away, Elise, and thank you again.
Great. Okay. Well, the first step is always to share screen, and let's see if I can do that. And hopefully everyone can see that, and someone will let me know if you can't. So here we go. Again, thank you to the Alliance for sponsoring this Zoom webinar in observance of International Peace Day, and really for all that the Alliance does to empower our community. I'm going to limit my remarks about my new book to 20 minutes so that we can have plenty of time to talk to Chester Edwards about his community work. My slides are not advancing, so what can go wrong will go wrong, right? Okay, so here we go. My son was finishing up at King Street School when I happened across this picture taken on May 29th, 1971. It shows a huge crowd occupying the Lexington Battle Green in Massachusetts. And if you remember your history, you know that this is the place where early in the morning on April 19th, 1775, British troops on their way to Concord shot and killed 8 of the colonial militiamen who had mustered there to protest the troops' occupation of Boston. It's a sacred site, in other words, because it's watered with the blood of our founders. Visitors to the site are supposed to reverentially express their gratitude to those who gave their lives for our nation's independence. So who were these men in fatigues acting so boisterously? While my son was at Portchester's middle school and later at the high school, I spent what free time I could grab unearthing the story behind this photograph. Last April, I finally published my account in the form of a book that puts you on the ground with 6 of the men in this crowd. One of the first things I found out about the photograph was that the men pictured were members of the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or VVAW, which was formed in 1967 as a speakers bureau. Men recently returned from Southeast Asia would put on suits and ties and give speeches about why they thought the war should end, or they would join protests against the war. Well, why were they against the Vietnam War? This was during the Cold War, and most of them had gone to Vietnam believing they had to stop the spread of communism from China to the rest of the world. They soon learned, however, that the Vietnamese did not want them there. In fact, Ho Chi Minh had quoted from the American Declaration of Independence in his plea to the international community to respect his country's right to self-government. Secondly, the veterans were angry about US military tactics. GIs were being sent out into the field to draw enemy fire so that the US knew where to direct its air power. In other words, GIs were being used as bait. And thirdly, veterans were very upset about the number of Vietnamese civilians being killed. Many of the Vietnamese fighting for their country's independence were guerrilla fighters and thus not in uniform, which meant American military personnel never knew if the Vietnamese person up ahead was a civilian or not, and thus had to kill rather than be killed. Other Vietnamese civilians were being murdered by frustrated and scared American troops who finally went off the deep end, as happened at My Lai. Well, despite the veterans' speeches and their participation in protests, VVAW did not make any headway. The war raged on, and VVAW decided to change its tactics. In the fall of 1970, 200 Vietnam veterans turned to political theater and historical reenactment. They put on their fatigues and walked from Morristown, New Jersey to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, staging mock search and destroy missions along the way, with the Vietnamese victims being played by other anti-war organizations. VVAW picked this particular march route as a means of establishing that it was not traitorous, but rather a patriotic organization. Morristown and Valley Forge were where George Washington's troops endured horrifically cold winters and near starvation conditions. Many deserted. The veterans, however, had not deserted their country, continuing to fight for it even after their official tours of duty were over. Just as the civil rights marchers had walked 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, the veterans walked a long distance over multiple days. They covered over 80 miles as citizen soldiers in the tradition of Washington troops. It was a demonstration of their determination to right their country's course. By that winter, so many Vietnam veterans had joined VVAW that the organization was able to create regional chapters. The New England chapter's office, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was staffed full-time by veterans like this man, Lenny Rotman, who you might recognize as the man in the center of the photograph I first showed you. Here in the office, where Lenny organized group therapy sessions for veterans suffering from PTSD, fielded requests from schools and other organizations looking for speakers, and planned future protests, he did not wear fatigues. Those were for when VVAW was out on the streets speaking or protesting, and the veterans wanted to make clear to the public that they knew about the war because they had fought in it. Here, the New England veterans are in the spring of 1971, wearing fatigues and carrying out mock search and destroy missions on Boston Common. Now, the M16s you see here, they might look very real. They're actually toy weapons made by Mattel. But for bystanders, seeing men in fatigues with automatic weaponry, rounding up prisoners, was frighteningly convincing. And here at Government Center in Boston, you see that despite the people playing the Vietnamese insisting that they were unarmed civilians, the veterans pretended to gun them down in cold blood rather than take the risk of being killed themselves. The idea here is to make bystanders feel what it's like to be going about their day, only to be interrogated by armed men and to thereby want to end the war. In mid-April of 1971, chapters of VVAW from across the country converged in Washington, D.C. for a 5-day protest against the war. It was the first time veterans had protested a war in which they had served. On the final day of the protest, over 1,000 veterans lined up to throw away their service medals on the steps of the US Capitol building. As you can see here, this veteran is throwing away a silver star. Military medals have long been a very respected sign of a man's bravery and patriotism. To reject these honors was heart-wrenching, and many openly sobbed. For our purposes, it's important to understand how the federal government reacted to the veterans' presence in the nation's capital. In advance of the veterans' arrival, the Justice Department had obtained an injunction from U.S. District Court in an attempt to prevent them from camping on the National Mall. When the Vietnam veterans voted to stay, even despite the injunction, in a demonstration of their constitutional right to assemble peaceably, the government kept up the pressure while President Nixon attempted to cast doubts on the veterans' credibility and their patriotism. The only reason there were no arrests was because the park police refused to enforce the injunction. These were men who had served their country. Many were injured, and virtually all of them were mourning the loss of at least one brother in arms. Well, the press and the public were equally outraged at the government's treatment of the nation's veterans. And thus, finally, after years of being largely ignored, VVAW was front page news. So by the time the New England chapter boarded the buses they had rented to head back to Cambridge, they were energized and determined to keep the national spotlight VVAW had finally won. With the nation's first 3-day Memorial Day weekend 6 weeks away at this point, the New England chapter advertised to area veterans another multi-day long-distance march like the one the fall before to Valley Forge. In the flyer they sent around, shown here, the veterans stressed the cost of the war in the number of American dead by featuring a photograph of coffins being loaded onto a plane for transport back to the United States. For their march route, the veterans decided to go from Concord to Boston because it was the reverse of the same route taken by patriot Paul Revere on the night of April 18, 1775, when he famously left his home in Boston to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that British troops were on the march, either with the intent of arresting them or of finding and destroying the military stores the Patriots had hidden in Concord. It was a brilliant route for the Vietnam veterans to choose. Firstly, many Americans were and still are familiar with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, in which he describes Revere ordering that signal lanterns be flashed from Boston's Old North Church to inform those outside of the then peninsular city of the direction that the troops were traveling, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, is how Longfellow famously put it. Secondly, the veterans' reversal of Revere's direction was a means of insisting that the nation, having invaded Vietnam, was traveling away from its founding ideals. We had once vanquished an imperial army, now we had become one. And thirdly, the route would take them not to 2 Revolutionary War sites, such as they had visited the fall before, but to 4 such sites, which gave the veterans additional opportunities to compare themselves to the nation's founders. So here's the first site. Now, truth be told, the veterans eschewed historical accuracy when they decided to follow Longfellow's well-known poem to the letter. While Paul Revere was actually captured en route from Lexington to Concord, but Longfellow imagines him ending his ride at the North Bridge in Concord. And I think that's because he wants to credit the Patriot rider with helping to birth a new nation. Again, you may remember from your history classes that the bridge is where later on the morning of April 19th, the colonial militia amassed after hearing the alarm. They weren't aware yet of the massacre that had taken place in Lexington hours before. When the imperial troops arrived and set fire to the town, the colonial militia fired what Ralph Waldo Emerson would later call the shot heard round the world. And of course, that shot instigated a running battle back to Boston. The bridge area has since been memorialized with various structures, including a replica bridge that you see here. And on its west side, also shown here, Daniel Chester French's famous Minuteman statue. Well, on May 28th, 1971, after a dinner served to them at the bridge by local supporters, the Vietnam veterans sat down to discuss the fact that they were facing a repeat of what had happened 6 weeks earlier in DC. For while they had permission to camp at the Old North Bridge, the Lexington Select Board, which is the Massachusetts equivalent of a town board or a board of trustees, had declined the veterans' request to camp on that town's battle green, which the town keeps sacred to the memory of the 8 colonists who were killed there. Here is the 1923 bylaw governing how the green may be used. No person shall behave or conduct himself on the battle green otherwise than in a quiet and orderly manner, in keeping with a respectful regard and reverence for the memory of the patriotic service and sacrifice so nobly rendered. The veterans took a vote about what to do and determined that they would set out for Lexington the next morning, where they decided they were prepared to commit civil disobedience. For them, ending the war was more important than observing a minor law. On the Saturday morning when they set off, they camped over Friday night, 2 war-wounded men agreed to go first. The statement this made is clear in this photograph, which ran on the front page of the Boston Globe. It presents the veterans not as Paul Revere, as they had originally planned, but as members of the colonial militia marching alongside the famous Minuteman statue, easily recognizable here in the background. While the image underscores, once again, that VVAW's descent is rooted in patriotism, it also contrasts the able-bodied colonists memorialized in metal and stone with the grievously wounded Vietnam veteran in the wheelchair, to make the point that the cost of the Vietnam War was too high. The veterans then proceeded to Concord's Monument Square, where we catch our second glimpse of the man making the peace sign on the Lexington battle green. Here in the foreground on the right, we see Lenny Rotman. He's helping to carry out another mock search destroy mission, this time in the shadow of Concord's soaring Civil War memorial obelisk. You can see one veteran in the green beret using a Thompson machine gun to pin a prisoner to the ground. This performance was a plea to bystanders to consider how shameful it was that a town that once fought an imperialist army and later fought against slavery was no longer on the right side, but was now sending American sons to fight for an imperialist cause. Well, the people of Concord responded. Many of them jettisoned their plans for the day and followed the veterans on foot to Lexington. Still thinking in terms of theater and historical reenactment, the veterans set off along the same road down which the colonists chased the imperial troops back to Boston, and they did it in single file. This was a way of staking a claim to being the rightful heirs to the nation's colonial militia, while the injured made clear to the public what they had suffered by patrolling in this same formation in Vietnam. More and more veterans and civilian supporters joined the patrol as word spread of the impending showdown in Lexington. A lot of people used phone chains back in the 70s. This is before we had cell phones. And there were also Boston radio and TV shows that helped get the word out. Well, 6 miles into what would be a 20-mile march, the veterans finally arrived at the Lexington Battle Green, where, as at the Old North Bridge, there's a Minuteman statue. You can see them here distributing leaflets, insisting on their right to speak with and alongside of those who fought for the nation's independence. Finally, the photograph I had started with should make sense. Lenny Rotman, by then hot and sweaty from the long walk, was following the wounded onto the green. He and other veterans are signaling with their hands that even though they were breaking a town bylaw, they had come in peace and for peace. I can also finally explain why we have so many photographs of this event. This particular one is taken by a very famous Life magazine photographer. And that the reason we have all these photographs has to do with the way in which the veterans are styling themselves here. It was a way of styling themselves that completely realigned the conversation about the war. What do I mean by that? Well, consider this iconic photograph. Many of you will have seen this before. It was taken outside of the Pentagon during an anti-war protest in 1967. On the one side, you see National Guardsmen, and on the other, you see a young woman using what the hippies called flower power in an assertion of love and peace. As the veterans walked from Concord to Lexington, they had broken off lilac branches and secured them to their uniforms, right? Here's one tucked in someone's boonie hat. There's one tucked in an M16, and here's another one. These are stacked arms, and they're tied together with lilacs. The veterans' appropriation of flower power, along with their long hair and beards, aligned them with the hippies, while their fatigues asserted their identities as soldiers. VVAW merged into one the two opposing identities on display in the Pentagon photograph, in an assertion that even the soldiers had come to realize that peace was the only way forward in Vietnam. Having been denied their request to camp, but also to conduct mock search and destroy missions in Lexington, Lenny Rotman devised another means of making clear the veterans' mission. After the veterans formed the circle you see here on the green, he danced into their midst and ceremoniously threw down his M16, much like the veterans had thrown away their medals in DC. Other veterans were inspired to imitate him. When each of them had danced into the middle of the battle green, It was littered with rejected weaponry, as you can see here. These are all toy M16s. They look so real. You wouldn't be able to buy such a real looking toy nowadays. The Lexington Select Board wasn't very happy because they didn't want to just ticket the veterans for breaking a bylaw. They wanted a means of deterring them from staying overnight on the battle green. So they served the veterans with an injunction, just as the Justice Department had done to VVAW in DC. At this point, the veterans took another vote about whether or not to commit civil disobedience, now that they were most likely going to be arrested if they stayed past the injunction's curfew of 10 p.m. Here you see them voting. The vote was unanimous. As word continued to spread of the Select Board's injunction, again, both by phone chain and by Boston radio and TV stations, still more area veterans and more area civilians came to the battle green to take a stand against the Vietnam War. By 10 p.m., there were 1,000 people on the tiny 2-acre green. My research indicates the reason for this tremendous outpouring of support has everything to do with the veterans' use of theater and historical reenactment. They were offering the public a way to step back into 1775 and repeat the stand taken by the colonists. And if you think about it, right, the bicentennial is approaching, it's 5 years away. Reenactment was becoming very popular, so the veterans were definitely tapping into that. Finally, the Select Board ordered what remains the largest mass arrest in the state's history. Over 400 people were taken into custody by the Lexington police, with backup provided by 2 other towns and the state police. Why only 400 of the 1,000? Well, the town had cleared its garage, its public works department's garage, and they were using that as a makeshift jail, and they ran out of space. So a lot of people who wanted to get arrested weren't. What you can see in this picture is that the police wore riot helmets. They were afraid the protesters would be violent. Now, VVAW members had taken courses in nonviolent protest, and they did an excellent job ensuring that no one expressed anger or otherwise gave the police cause to proceed with physical force. And the police did a commendable job of treating the veterans with respect, although I think that's in part because the town was comprised of wealthy white residents whose presence was protective. As the veterans had hoped, the national and even the international press took notice, impressed by the veterans' peaceable actions and their willingness to go to jail to make a statement about the war's immorality. After being held overnight, the veterans were tried in district court, which opened on Sunday specifically to process their case. They then proceeded to Bunker Hill, where they spent the 3rd night of the march without incident. On Memorial Day, they finished their march on Boston Common, where 3,000 people amassed to welcome them home and applaud their efforts. In their final use of theater, the veterans ceremoniously destroyed their plastic M16s. This turned out to be a powerfully cathartic moment for the veterans, many of whom sobbed as they recalled what the violence of the war had cost them. Indeed, one of VVAW's enduring legacies is its rejection of the stoicism demanded of soldiers by the military and normative American masculinity. Did VVAW succeed in ending the war immediately? No. But the organization did make it more difficult for Dixon to expand the war, which we now know he very much wanted to do. When I interviewed Lenny Rotman about his experience in Vietnam and with VVAW, he told me that his experience during that period was transformative. He became someone who could work with others to organize a highly effective means of promoting peace and better services for veterans. And of course, that brings us to another Vietnam veteran, Portchester's own Chester Edwards.
Thank you for that, Elise. That was fascinating. I don't know that I ever knew about that event. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. And before we get to your special guest this evening, we want to take a survey of the folks who are with us this evening. So Raghav, could you throw up the survey questions for our attendees to respond to? So we want those of you who are with us, please respond to the survey. Are you a veteran? If you are, did you join the military after 9/11? And if you are not a veteran, do you know someone who is? And we will show the results of that survey after your interview with Chat.
And I'm going to share screen again so that we can all look at these fantastic pictures that Chester very kindly supplied for me.
Terrific.
Just take a moment and look at this first one.
Let's not take too long a moment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing these with us. Chester, tell us a little bit about how and why you enlisted in the Navy as soon as you turned 17 in 1966.
Well, I had spent most of my life in close poverty, welfare, and other things. I had left home at 16, quitting school, and joined a traveling carnival, similar to the one that goes to Corpus Christi and sets up the rides and such. Did that for close to a year. When I got back home, I was aimless, and I walked by a naval recruiting office, and it looked like a great opportunity for my future. So I grabbed it, and that's the beginning.
Maybe just explain to everyone that when you're 17, you do have to have the signature of a parent, Chester.
I knew you were going to make me do this. Actually, what I did is I took the paperwork home, forged my mother's signatures, and returned them to the recruiter who asked no questions.
Wow. Yeah. So you were really, really young.
Yes.
You really, really were young. This is another picture of Chester. Chester, you told me that you arrived in country, which is like military speak for you arrived in Vietnam in April of 1968, which for those who don't know is at the end of the Tet Offensive. That means, in other words, you were in Vietnam during the most dangerous and deadliest year of the war. If you don't mind, tell us what your assignment was and where exactly you served in Vietnam.
Well, I was United States Navy. I was assigned to a mobile riverine force, which was a group of armed boats whose job was basically to take troops of various military branches and levels of expertise into missions off the Mekong River in the south of Vietnam, using our home base of Dong Tam. And then go through those rivers, make sure that they were clear, drop the troops off, watch the back door and protect the back, and then bring them out again when they finish their missions, along with those who came back in body bags.
And I know you said that you yourself have not seen Apocalypse Now. I'm only mentioning it for audience members who might have seen the film because there is a boat in that film. And from what you had described to me, for those who haven't been in the military, that might be the film not, but the boats in that film might be a good approximation, because you did explain to me too that they were not swift boats.
No,
this is another touchstone for Americans.
Correct. If people saw Apocalypse Now, in the coming attractions, there was a boat convoy going down a river with 2 or 3 different types of armored boats. That's what we were on.
Okay. What do you most want people to know about that year? I believe you were, everyone's there a year, 12 months and however many days. What would you most want people to know about that year?
It was a challenge, to say the least. It was difficult, as there were a lot of friends who didn't come back. There were a lot that came back with injuries that are hard to describe, beyond not only the physical, limbs missing, etc., but Agent Orange, which is impacting everyone through today, as well as those who are coming back with a variety of burdens that they're carrying in their minds, which is extremely difficult for people who haven't been there, who haven't had PTSD, etc., to understand. But certain actions, smells, noises, can trigger a reaction to put us right back where we were then. So, I mean, all of these things impacted everybody. Were there some good times? Yes, there was camaraderie. There was, a lot of things we did when we weren't in combat conditions or on patrol that were good. But overall, it was not an experience that I would want my children to have to go through.
You're making me recall what Freud said about the unconscious, which the unconscious has no sense of time. when you talked about something putting you right back in it, that's because of that no sense of time and you're unconscious. And I didn't ask you this before, but I'm curious, do you remember where you're standing? I mean, there are a lot of sandbags here. Maybe you could explain what those were for and what that building is.
The sandbags go around the Quonset huts, or hooches as we call them, and their sole purpose was to absorb shrapnel from mortars and other, rockets, etc., that were thrown into the military base by whoever the enemy at that point was.
And are you wearing cut-off fatigue pants here, or you might not remember?
No, those are just a pair of jeans that were cut off. We were off duty at the time and just kind of hanging out, trying to be macho man.
And again, I mean, it's just worth remembering, you can't even be 20 years old yet.
I was 19.
Yeah, that's, for someone whose son is 20, that's just really hard for me to wrap my mind around. Well, Chester, look, you've had an extremely successful business career, which is a topic for another day. But on LinkedIn, you now describe yourself thusly, and I'm going to quote your LinkedIn profile: veteran advocate working to enhance the lives of all veterans and facilitate the transition from the military mindset to productive civilian life, end quote. Tell us some more about, I mean, you've said something about why veterans need help and continue to need help because of the unconscious having no time, because of Agent Orange, because of bodily injuries that persist. Well, tell us some of the things that you're doing to provide the assistance that veterans sometimes need.
Well, let me give a little background to that first. What a lot of folks don't realize is when you're in the military, you are not given a lot of choices and things. You're told where to eat, where to sleep, where you're going to work, what your job is, what your facility is, who your bosses are, and who your playmates are, who the other soldiers. And then they hand you a little piece of paper called a DD-214, which, coming out of Vietnam, they handed you the paper and gave you a kick in the butt and said, goodbye, good luck. That's a very harsh way to go into a civilian world where none of those things are available to you. You have to find a job. You have to find somewhere to sleep and eat and work. And it's extremely difficult to transition from the one mindset where you're really, and I hate to use the word automaton, but pretty close to just doing step by step what you're told in the step by step way they taught you, to a civilian world where you have to forage for yourself for everything. A lot of people came out and had absolutely nowhere to go and no one to go to. We still have, and you want me to mention some of my programs, working with an organization called ProVetis out of New York, which provides mentoring for veterans. And we mentor Korean War veterans, Vietnam War veterans, and actually some World War II veterans who are still having trouble with that transition process. The job that we're trying to do is to provide a battle buddy or a mentor who can kind of guide them along to find the things they need in life, find housing, find work, find groups and friends, and how to get themselves reintegrated into society. 50 plus years, some have not made it there yet. The new guys coming out of the military now have it a little better, but they still are facing all of those same issues. ProVetis is working with a national program called ETS to help transition active duty service members into society immediately of coming out, so they don't have all those years in between. I'm also working with the Westchester County Veterans Service Committee, which is a group of veterans representing all of the veteran organizations in the county. And our purpose is to identify problems and issues and bring that to government's attention, the other organizations' attention, and try to move resources to support them. I'm with Hudson Valley Honor Flight, where we honor the veterans with a one-day all-expense-paid trip to Washington, D.C. to visit their monuments, many of which have never seen them, by bringing together groups of 70 to 90 common themed, common thought veterans so they can share that experience. Taking veterans into the Vietnam Memorial is extremely difficult and triggering for many of them. There are, VVA, Vietnam Veterans of America, VFW, American Legion, all of which I'm a part of and working actively with, among some others that we probably don't have time to dig into.
Well, I actually have a couple follow-up questions already, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
First of all, I want to make sure you say clearly and slowly for people who don't know Provetus, and maybe spell it for people so they can find it.
It's spelled Provetus.
Great, thank you. I think that
you can go there online, and there's ability to fill out an application to be a mentor, both in the court system as well as a sponsor in the ETS program.
So people should definitely check out that website. And then my other follow-up question was, I was going to jump in and say, well, in World War II, people came home with their units, whereas in Vietnam, you rotated in and out as an individual in most cases. And I was thinking, well, so it was easier to come home from World War II. But then you said 50 years on, some World War II veterans are still struggling. Did I hear that correctly?
You did. People didn't always come back as units, as you mentioned. There were many branches that came back as individuals. There were people, even within an Army unit, that were rotated in and out as replacements.
In World War II?
All through, including Vietnam and, Korea and Afghanistan.
Wow.
So, that mental battle is going from, one look of where life is, all stable and fixed and told what to do, moving into an open-ended world. And even if you come out and get a job and then you fall homeless and, lose jobs and such, you go back into that transition phase again. Once a military person, always a military person. Once a veteran, that always stays with you.
And I'm friends with your wife on Facebook, and I follow with great interest the Hudson Honor Flights. And just so people understand, it's not going to DC to sort of get applause, right? It's a chance to maybe work on closure. I mean, if you're a Vietnam veteran and you're going to visit the wall, right? I mean, tell us about why that might be an important trip for someone to take, and particularly with a buddy.
Well, we found that a lot of veterans don't talk about their service, even with their families. Bringing them together with a group of other veterans gives them a whole different atmosphere that they're more comfortable in and able to open up, even to family members after that. We've had veterans show up. A World War II veteran came to be on an honor flight. And his family told him, "You're crazy. You can't go on honor flight. You're not a veteran." And he was a highly decorated World War II veteran and never told anyone in his life that he was until this.
And does
after the honor flight he went on, I'm told, opened up to his family, and it helped him be able to deal with some of these ghosts that have been in his brain forever.
Does the airline help with that? I mean, do they offset any of the cost, or do you fundraise and raise all the money yourselves?
No, it's fundraised. We have no grants for the airlines, since there are several hundred hubs that do honor flights. It is another income stream for them. So no, they don't donate or give it. We are very lucky in the Hudson Valley to have ShopRite, who gives us quite a bit of money to support us, and we're very grateful for that. But other than that, it's just general fundraising. People coming up with money because they think it's a great idea.
Wow. I'm going to move on because I have so many questions for you. But I want to share with everyone another photograph of you, Chester, and this is you being honored. I assume it was your day in Port Chester. Of course, this is our former mayor of Port Chester, and Joan, I believe this happened before you were on the board of trustees, which is why you are not in this photograph, but I did want to just share this. And then I also had one last slide before
If you want to go back 1 second, Elise,
yeah.
You'll notice that I said I was in the Navy, yet I'm wearing an Army uniform. that might
Oh,
be a bit
explain that.
confusing.
Yeah, explain that.
I was in the Navy from 66 to 72. I got out like most people did, joined the normal world, corporations, family, etc. Shortly after 9/11 in 2003, I re-enlisted in the New York State Guard. Went in as an E5 enlisted, and I retired in 2018 as a colonel.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad. No, I'm glad you explained that. Thank you. And this is our last slide, and this should be very familiar to any Port Chester resident on the webinar tonight. But I did want to take a moment to remember the young people our town lost in the Vietnam War, and whose names are here in Lyon Park at our town's Vietnam War Memorial. I believe there's one name missing, which some of you may be able to tell me more about later. But at this point, Chester and I would both be happy to take your questions and or comments.
If I could just make one last comment
Yeah.
at the memorial, every Christmas Day, we gather at that memorial to remember those we lost there and to meet with some of the fellow, some from Port Chester. Personally, I was not. I was a transplant in 72, but we come together on Christmas morning to honor them and remember them every year.
Can anyone attend that, Chester? Or is that?
Yeah, it's open to the public. Anyone can.
Okay. Oh, wow. This so much good information. Thank you. And I think Joan's going to come back on and field.
Here I am.
For us.
Here I am. Thank you. That was really a very interesting exchange. Thank you for those questions, and Chet for your contributions. I want to just remind everyone who's on the call or on the Zoom to pose whatever questions you might have in the Q&A, so that for either Elise or for Chet to respond to. But I wanted to throw out a couple of questions, if I might, while folks are teeing up their own questions. And Elise, this question is for you. What kind of response did you get from the Vietnam vets, as you approach them to interview them for your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chester's helped me understand the responses that I got, because, well, first of all, when I contacted Chester Edwards and said, "Can I talk to you about your service in Vietnam?" he just said he'd come right over to my house. And so I found that most people who served in Vietnam and have served in the military are incredibly generous with their time, their expertise, their volunteerism. And it's just been such an enriching project for me, because I've met so many incredible people. But as Chester pointed out, you know, you're always a veteran, and the unconscious has no time, and people sometimes continue to struggle with that period when you know, you were in harm's way. And I did reach out to one veteran and asked to interview him, and he sent me a cease and desist letter telling me that just my letter had triggered his PTSD, which was quite bad.
Wow.
And of course, I mean, I immediately burst into tears, because it really upset me to think that I had been the reason that someone had been, that their PTSD had been triggered. The metaphors we use from the military are just everywhere, and it's hard to get around them. But at any rate, I was just beside myself and really upset about that. But at the same time, and obviously did not try to contact him again. But at the same time, you know, it just drove home for me one of the reasons that I think people in the early 70s might have joined VVAW if there was a chapter in their town, and there certainly were not chapters in every town. It just, there was this big chapter in Massachusetts, is because they needed a place to go to talk, because they needed to be with people who understood who they'd been with. So this particular man, who did not want to speak with me, had been a very active member of VVAW, and I have these fantastic pictures of him. I have a picture of him marching with VVAW covered in lilacs. Like, he just completely, instead of camo, right? Like, he used the lilacs as a kind of camo. So very, very active. But then something happened about 25 years after that. He detailed it all for me in the letter. That was what was also really interesting, was I got the full story, but it was like, don't contact me, but this is what happened. And, 25 years later, everything was fine. He had a family, blah, blah, blah. And it just came back and he was in it. He was in it and wasn't going to talk about it. So my hope for him is that he's doing better. I don't know. But again, but virtually everyone else, like Lenny Rotman, I mean, that's just someone I'm like, hey, I found this picture of you. Are you this guy? And they would say, come on over. Come on over, and they would sit with me for hours, and I would interview them and then transcribe the interviews, and I've made this really nice archive for myself.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so our next question is from Seth Walworth, and he wants to know, how different is it for combat veterans versus those who are not in combat?
That's a question for
so
Seth.
I believe so, and I imagine that might be a question on their return.
It's a difficult question. There are a lot of veterans who don't feel like they deserve veteran status because they were not in combat. So they are having their own level of survivor guilt, maybe. But there are also many in the military who never were in combat, but were in extremely difficult jobs. If you look at the pictures of the Marines coming back from Afghanistan, the ones who were killed at the end, the people in that center that receive those bodies are constantly reminded of and handling and processing this, and it's extremely difficult for them. There are many who went through combat who come back and they're really fine. They're, for some reason, and who knows whether it's because of how they were brought up or where they are mentally, that they're able to handle it and can go through life fine. And then there are others who still sit in wheelchairs in combat clothing at the wall every day and can't get past that. So it's every level of pain and issue, from I'm okay to I never left the United States, but I did X, X, and X, and therefore that's always in the back of my mind. And it's what could trigger that can, as I said before, it could be a smell, it could be the sound of a helicopter, it could be seeing a name, it could be going to the wall. Right. I've seen Korean veterans and World War II veterans have difficult times going to their memorials, and those are way, way years past.
Got it.
So it's very individual.
I just want to, sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind folks to pose their questions in the Q&A. And what I'd like to do is, we did a survey of the folks who were on the call. They answered 3 questions. They were asked 3 questions. Hopefully they answered all 3. So Raghav, can you throw up the results of that polling? Oh.
No.
Okay. Wow. So we have no veterans other than Chet, who's on the call with us. I
wasn't allowed to vote, though.
Right. And then in the second question, certainly if we have no veterans, then that second question was, is not surprising. And but yes to the third question.
So let me throw out something for you also.
Sure.
And a lot of people are not totally aware of this. Members of the National Guard, unless they were activated for federal duty, even though they spent 25 or 30 years in uniform, are not considered veterans by the VA. So that's I don't know if any of those folks here who said, no, I am not a veteran, but
might be
served,
members, right?
And just not activated to get that.
Thank you for making that distinction. And so we still do have a few minutes left. And so there's another question that talks about, and it's really not a question so much, but it's more of a statement that the Vietnam War was never really declared a war, correct?
Yeah, it's correct. It was never a declared war. And actually, Korea and Afghanistan were not declared wars. They're police actions or whatever other nomenclature you want to put on them, but they were not, well, while they were wars, in reality, they were not technically declared that by our legislatures.
Right. So some people use the word conflict. I'm sorry, Elise, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that for some of the Vietnam veterans who decided to join VVAW, that was something that really troubled them. They felt that it was an illegal action, and they were very bothered by that. And I just to finish, maybe to just add another thing about PTSD. You see a lot of conversation about how to cure it, how to ameliorate the symptoms, et cetera, and all those things are so important. But I think it's just worth saying on International Peace Day that the way to not have PTSD from war is to not have wars. So sometimes when I see the U.S. government, so intent on thinking about it, I'm pleased that they're thinking about it, because these are serious wounds that you cannot see, but they're catastrophic. Again, from VVAW's point of view, this is an organization that continues to exist. You should check out their website. It's vvaw.org. They continue to work, like Chester does, on veterans' well-being. But again, right? Like if we could just not have another war, we wouldn't have people suffering from this. I know that seems like a banal point, but it's just one that usually doesn't get said when you're talking about PTSD.
I think all of us would like to not have a war. You train for it, you prepare for it, you go into it when it's necessary, but nobody really wants it. And I would just throw out a thought that if your neighbor's house is burning, what do? You run in to help the neighbor. You don't walk away and go to the grocery store and say, the hell with the neighbor. And I think that's a lot of how we get into some of these situations, Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And so, oh boy, there's something here that's a bit long. So I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get to it. But with just a few minutes that we have left, I wonder, this is not a discussion that we hear about or know about very often, and we could probably spin off and talk about a lot of different things from this. But what would be sort of the takeaway that you would want people to, take away from this discussion? What's the most important thing that you want people to take away from this conversation, from the idea of Vietnam and all that it entails?
I'm going to go first because I know Chester's going to say something far more important, and we'll let him have the last word. So I'll go first only for that reason. Otherwise, I would not jump in front of him at all. And I just wanted to say, for me, there are two takeaways. One is that studying what VVAW did can be incredibly useful for young activists. Where did the young people of Lexington go for their Black Lives Matter protest? That Minuteman statue in their hometown, right? And that made their message resonate. So I think VVAW is such a great example. A lot of people don't know about them. Study them. They have fantastic, they were really good at using performance, the power of place, to make their voices heard. So that's my takeaway from my book. But just from the session, I want to say, get to know your neighbors in Port Chester, because it turns out that Chester and I live around the corner from each other, and I had not asked to sit down with him and talk. And, just again, hearing about his experience and seeing how important it is to him to continue to do this work was really meaningful for me. So we do, Joan, live in a community with just so many people with fantastic histories and who are doing incredible things. So yeah, get to know your Port Chester neighbors, but I'll leave the last word for Chester.
My takeaway is going to be a little different. It has been our history to help other people and to try to protect the democracy and such. Sometimes the methodology used by politicians keeps us from actually doing the job the way it should be done. History is often told from the victors, not from those who needed the assistance and didn't get it. Afghanistan, there were a lot of positive things that occurred over there because of our presence, yet you see everything folds in as soon as we leave. And it's just a reminder that If you're going to do something, in my mind, you do it. You don't draw arbitrary lines and say you can't cross this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. World War I and World War II, you went out and you walked from one end of the battlefield to the other. There were clear lines. And when you got to the other end, the war was over. And the victor is the one who is hailed. I hear that the Afghanistan people didn't want us there. The Vietnam people didn't want us there. And what are they going to say after the other regimes have taken over and oppressed them? My thought is that we need to fight these wars if we're going to do it correctly, with the least amount of casualties to the most positive end that we can get, or not get involved at all.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to share with you a comment that we received from one of our attendees. Her name is Stephanie Rugoff. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But she coordinates a project called We Are Not Your Soldiers. Have either of you heard about this?
I have not.
Okay. So she describes it as bringing veterans into classrooms to dialogue with students about their experiences in the military, and that they deal with so many of the issues that were raised here this evening: PTSD, moral injury, readjustment to civilian life. And she also raised the point that veterans have the highest suicide rate in the country. She wanted to share her contact information for anyone who was interested to, to learn more or to work with the project. And so I'd like to offer her that shout out, if you will. And so the website is We Are Not Your Soldiers at worldcan'twait.net. We Are Not Your Soldiers at worldcan'twait.net. Her number is area code 347-581-2677.
Thank you.
And she thanks you very much for this excellent program. And thank you, Stephanie, for joining us this evening. And so we want to be true to our word with a hard stop at 8 o'clock. I think we nailed it, folks. But just want to make sure that people know where they can get a copy of Elise's book. It's on Amazon, it's on Apple Books, and it's at Barnes and Nobles, correct?
And it's at the Portchester Library, where you can.
And there are copies at our very own Chester-Rye Public Library. So if you want to pick up a copy, don't know if they're out or if they're all in, but they are available at the library. And so you can check the Chester-Rye Public Library. And so also, again, just want to make sure that folks know how to, there's still one on the shelf at the library. Thank you, Stacy. So get it while it's there. Also, just in the event that you want to know more about Sustainable Portchester Alliance and what we do, please visit our own website at portchesteralliance.org. And if you have a question for us, please send us an email at portchesteralliance@gmail.com. And we're also on Facebook, so you can friend us there and see what we're up to. And so once again, thank you all. Thank you, Elise, and thank you, Chet, for taking the time to talk with us. This was really a fascinating discussion. I enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody on the line did. And we thank you for your service. We thank you for your efforts, Elise. And what are you working on next? Are you working on your next book yet?
Not sure yet.
Not sure yet. Okay. But find Elise on the tennis courts at Portchester High School.
I'm trying to get used to being an empty nester. So there's that.
Ah, yeah. Okay. Well,
give me some pointers there, Joan.
Have fun with that. All right, everybody. Good night. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.